Hi, so Ion Hazzikostas sat down and did another live Q&A a few days ago, and I'm going to go through most of the points that were raised there and add in my thoughts onto them. A couple of things I want to say first of all. First of all, there are a couple of points in there that I sort of feel I'd like to discuss in their own video. If I were to discuss everything here, it would go on a very long time. It may still go on for a little bit as it is, but there are enough key points that sort of deserve their own vlog. The other thing is, now, there's already comments come out of people, you know, approving or disapproving of various things says, and there's going to be a number of times when on this I'm going to go, yep, I totally agree with that, and there's going to be frowny faces from me as well. But I think what I would say at this point is, although we may not always approve of answers given, one thing I definitely approve of is the fact that these are done at all. These didn't used to be done. It's worth bearing that in mind. And if anyone's a new player, just worth explaining. These live Q&As didn't exist, really, before Ion Hazzikostas rose to prominence. He is the one who kickstarted them off. And although, you know, we'll sort of like some things he says and not like other things he says, I personally do like the fact he does them. And he, although obviously they pick and choose their questions, and more especially pick and choose their answers, nonetheless, they don't shy away from the topics that people want to discuss. We may not always get as full an explanation as we like, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's all in-house. I mean, what I find quite curious, they start this, and Law, who's the community manager who fronts these as the interviewer, so to speak. It's very pseudo-interviewer because they both work for the same company. It's always hilarious when he sort of says, oh, you know, and he's on Ion Hazzikostas, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just thinking to myself, you both work in the same place. You both work in the same building. It's really weird. I mean, that's the sort of thing I might say to someone if I were interviewing them. So, for example, if I were to interview Ion Hazzikostas, which never happened, but if I were, that's the sort of thing I'd say to him. It's not really the sort of thing you say to someone who works in the same building as you. But anyway. So, in terms of some of the things, some of these things are really quick and easy. Some of them a little bit more detailed. So, about the artifact appearances, I think this is... There's a bit of confirmation on this. They've said for quite a long time, pretty much the whole of Legion, that they would like to see a system of having us be able to keep the artifact appearances, to be able to transmog them, because we're going back to normal weapons as far as can be told in the next expansion. We're certainly not having artifact weapons, but we do get to keep those skins, so we can use them for transmog purposes. But for at least early in Legion, what was coming out of these questions was that once Legion was over, you wouldn't be able to obtain them anymore. So although you'd be able to transmog them, it's only if you'd actually obtained them. Anything you don't get in Legion, you don't get. They've changed that a little bit to say that there will be some artifact appearances you can still obtain even when Legion's done and dusted. But there are some that you won't be able to do. So they've said, for example, the one for doing a plus 15 mythic dungeon, you won't be able to get the artifact appearance for that once Legion is over. They also said for the Mage Tower, you won't be able to get that artifact appearance either. Whether that means the Mage Tower itself will sort of stop coming up, I'm not sure. Because there was another question later on asking about the buildings in general on the Broken Shore. Because it was said when they first came out, obviously, you know, they rotate, but they rotate according to people turning in the war supplies. And, of course, now that it's oldish content, it's not devoid of people anymore, but it's oldish. Most people are on Argus now. And obviously that, in theory, would slow down the rate at which these buildings pop up. It hasn't done because Blizzard have done what they said they would do and increase the rates, you know, reduce basically the amount of war supplies needed to activate them. But there could still come a time when there's no one on the Broken Shore at all. Would they then either permanently put them up or just put them on a set rotation? This gives you a bit of a lead into the fact that they may not do either, because if they can just keep enough people on the Broken Shore to top it up for the rest of Legion, and then if after Legion no one goes there at all, it's sort of fine if the buildings don't even show up, isn't it? Because if we can't even get the Mage Tower artifact appearance, none of the other buildings will have any significance for us when that's no longer current content. So they may just leave it so that they never pop up again. I don't know about that. But they could certainly do that, and that would be okay. And obviously, all the artifacts transmog to transmog onto a weapon would equally apply to druid forms as well. So druids would still be able to have those forms. It's sort of transmogging onto their very selves, I suppose. They haven't given any details as yet, as far as I know, on exactly how they're going to do that. They might just add in a separate transmog tab, like icon for druids specifically to allow them to do that. Or it might just still transmog the weapon and your whole form gets that, transmog. I don't know. Legendary items. So I talked about legendary tokens yesterday, didn't I? In terms of the upgrade of it, they did say that you're going to upgrade the legendaries in the same ways they had before. The argument was, and I think this is a matter of opinion, so it's just one of those things, you take it or leave it. They said that although, when the item level of legendaries can be increased, any new legendaries you get after that point are automatically at the highest item level. So at the moment, for example, any legendary you get is going to be 970. The previous one was, what was it? Was it 940? Did it go 30 each time? I can't remember. Whatever it was. And any legendaries you had before they suddenly became 970, you had to get like resources and then get yourself a distilled titan essence or something like that from an NPC in Dalaran and upgrade it. So, I mean, what they could do, of course, is just have when that patch day comes out that they all instantly get upgraded. They said that they don't like the idea of equipment just randomly becoming stronger overnight with that, like the fairy. They didn't use that term, but the legendary fairy comes along and just randomly upgrades it without you doing anything. They don't like that idea. I just think that's a matter of opinion. Some people will say, well, any new ones I get drop will be at the highest one anyway. They're all legendary. They're all supposed to be the same item level. What does it matter? Some other people will agree with Blizzard's point of view, which is, we had this item. It shouldn't suddenly change without us doing something to it. So I think that's just one of those ones you either take it or leave it. In terms of the Mythic Plus dungeons, they said with the Invitational, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, that they've identified some things in there, particularly around utility. He also talked later on about the idea of, someone asked, would you bring any abilities back that were pruned out for Legion? And Ian said yes. And he said, in particular, some utility abilities potentially they could bring back. But he said a few curious things. He said, first of all, because my issue with certain bits of utility is when they're very strong, then the classes who have them are hugely desirable. So, for example, having a heroism or time warp or whatever effect makes you extremely strong. So you generally want to take someone. Sure, you have drums if you don't have such a person, but they're not actually as strong either. So if you're really pushing high keys, you really want someone to do that. You want battle reses. Now, they talked about this as well, the fact that they may limit battle reses in dungeons. At the moment, they're not limited at all, other than by how many you actually have and whether on cooldown or not. Whereas in raids they are, because they are so powerful. But with Mythic Plus dungeons being a competitive version of dungeons, then battle reses are very powerful. And it makes the classes that have them very powerful. I mean, thankfully there are several that do. So it doesn't make, it's not one class that has this Ultra One. Unlike one piece of utility that they did bring back, and he talked about bringing back, was the Shroud of Concealment for rogues. So this is like your AoE stealth that you can use. That can be very powerful in Mythic Plus dungeons. I don't want to overstate it. It's not like it's used all the time. But it can be used at certain times to help you bypass things and save a bit of time. And that's the type of utility I'm actually not as in favour of, because, one class has it. But this is where they ran into a bit of a clash with the Legion philosophy. This idea is they don't want too much homogeneity of abilities. So, they don't want everyone having all the same sort of stuff. He talked about, at one point, immunities. And he says there's probably too many immunities, as if they're going to scale it back. But the problem then is, if you scale it back, so that not many have it, when you need it, and we all know that in raids and dungeons, immunities can be really powerful, because if there's something that needs soaking, someone with an immunity, assuming the immunity itself allows them to soak, but then sometimes if immunities don't, because there have been ones in the past. I remember Zul'Harak in WoD as a fight, there was a soaking mechanic there, but I couldn't do it. You know, my bubble wouldn't work because it was an immunity. Immunities wouldn't soak it, so the whole raid would boom. But if you had something that was a very, very powerful absorb instead, that would work. That would ironically work better than immunity. But the problem is, yeah, if you scale these back so there's not as many classes have them, you increase the value of the classes who do, and you make it so that they've got a guaranteed raid spot and you need more of them. And having several of one particular class in a raid now, especially as it's only 20 man, basically means that there's much less room for those who don't have those abilities or don't have abilities that are useful on the fight. Because it's all very well saying that all classes have some utility, but if that utility isn't needed, then that class isn't needed. Now, on a fight where you don't need a lot of utility, it doesn't matter, just take who you want. Take your 20 players, your 20 best players, or the 20 players that need that fight if it's a simple fight. But where you need a lot of utility on a fight, and a lot of the tough fights you need a lot of utility, then that means you take the ones that provide the utility that's good on that fight, the other ones out in the cold. And that's an inherent problem with that philosophy, in my opinion, anyway. But, yeah, they did. So what they said is they wanted classes to bring their own unique utility. But they also said as well, so let's say you give some utility to a class which is similar to another class's, but because, you know, they talked about the idea that, but if the other one's was the best of it, then you wouldn't take the other one. It's like saying, well, I've just got a second-rate version of that. But again, you know, it's my view that it's like, well, don't give them a second-rate version of it then. You know, there's plenty of things that a lot of classes share anyway, like cleansing abilities. I mean, they took that away in Legion for a start. It was going to be that only healers could like dispel things. So Paladin, as me as a rep Paladin, I had the ability to cleanse poisons and diseases. And that was removed in the Legion Alpha. We got it back again. They relented on that one. But there was a time when, you know, it was only the healing specs that had them. And then they sort of brought that back. Interrupts. I mean, all melee have interrupts on roughly the same cooldown. Shamans and Demon Hunters have slightly more advantageous interrupts. But by and large, we've all got those as well, because that's an important core raid mechanic. It's not that you have to interrupt a lot on Dungeons and Raids, but when you do, you need those melee to rotate that interrupt, so you give them all it. So again, you know, if you're going to have some utility that is needed in common raid mechanics, then I think they should find some way of giving it to as many classes as possible to avoid the situation where one class is like, you don't bring anything, and you know, we need people who bring stuff. In terms of mission rewards, this was something I was quite pleased about. That people were sort of saying about those people who've managed to get their followers up to 950 at item level. I've not even got my 6 to 925 yet, but some people have managed to get all theirs to 950. And they're saying the actual mission rewards are not very good at the moment. They said they had sort of done a fix so that they've improved them a little bit, but the crucial thing about this is that when Antorus comes out, obviously we're going to get a new mission for the Antorus raid cache. That's going to need those 950 item level followers. And I think it's quite good that, you know, we have been allowed to level up, because we will, or even though I'm, you know, not getting these missions very often to be able to upgrade my followers, I will have them by the time the Antorus raid comes out. And it is good that we've been given a decent amount of time to do that. So I think that's really positive. That it's not a case that this content has come out in line with Antorus, so we're going to get these mission caches and we can't use them. You know, the fact that we will have the champions to do them. So the only thing is, what quality reward do we get from those caches, and that's just dependent on how much Antorus and at what level you do it then as well. So I quite like that idea. But in general about mission rewards, I mean, I'm not sure a huge number of people are that bothered, because you don't have to send them off. Also, I would say you don't have a real problem with order resources these days anyway. But I mean, maybe that's because we do so many world quests these days, because we're back on the AP treadmill, and world quest is a pretty good way to get it. And then some of those just naturally give order resources, which we do anyway. But I do at least like the fact that we are going to have those. We've got enough time to get those characters, those champions, up to level. The Argus whistle was a really weird one, because someone asked the question, can we not have the Argus whistle? You know, you get 4 Argusian Reach rep. Can we not have that account wide? When you get it on one character, you can get it on the others. And Ion Hazzikostas said, yes, what a good idea, we'll do that. And he was quite clear as well, because I know someone put in a comment on video yesterday, oh, it's only going to be like a toy and you're still going to need the revered rep on your other characters to use it. And I thought, well, that's a bit strange. You might as well not have it account wide. Now, listening to what he said, he was basically, I'm sure it was fairly clear that he was saying that, yeah, because he was talking about being a hassle to get revered rep on all your characters. He says, no, you should just get it on one character and then you can get access to that. Because from their point of view, because with ALTs, they described it as they want to make as much as stuff as account wide as possible. I don't think they go quite far enough with that. But there's some things where I think they do have a good reason for not. I'm going to come to one of them in a moment. But with the whistle point of view, yeah, it was announced like today that it was on Wowhead. Admittedly, I've not seen a Blizzard response on this. That the hotfix has gone on. I'm not, but then I'm sure someone was saying, yeah, it works. I've just been on myself and I'm thinking, it doesn't actually work. So I don't know if there's something I'm doing wrong. I've tried clicking on the whistle and stuff like that, even on my main, using it and stuff like that, and it doesn't. It's not in my toy box. There's either a flute or a whistle. I can't use it on other characters on Argus. So I don't know whether the hotfix has been properly implemented yet, or I'm doing something wrong, or what. But in theory, that is something that's supposed to be in. It seemed clear to me from what he was saying that you get it on one character and you get it on your whole account. But the other thing, yeah, the other thing he was talking about in terms of so we had this whole debacle about the World Quest. There was a statement from Blizzard as well. It was nothing to do with a Q&A, which seemed to suggest that World Quests would become account wide after one character got so far into the chain, got those achievements at the end of it, I think. Now, that hasn't happened. But the reason, you know, that they don't do that, I don't know where the mix-up came in terms of the fact that it would be possible, because there was definitely a blue post with a hotfix that sort of said this. It was maybe just poorly worded. But the reason why we can't have them account-wide does actually make sense. He gave that reason, which is to say that effectively what it is, it's because Argus is phased. A lot of the Argus places we go to are sort of phased. So, for example, when we go to the Xenodar to rescue Zera, what that area looks like before we rescue Zera and afterwards is very different. So you can't just unlock it for a character who hasn't done that quest chain, because you're going to get conflicts there. I suppose, and he didn't say this, but the same equally applies to the relative positions and locations of other major characters like Illyrian, Illidan, and Turalyon and so on. Again, it wouldn't make sense for Turalyon to be on the ship before you've sort of come across him, would it, if you hadn't done any of the quests at all? So that I buy. I buy the fact that you can't, or it wouldn't be sensible to unlock those, because you would get these weird conflicts that might actually cause problems, so that you should actually have to do the quest for that. And I suppose it's not a terrible, I mean, it's, you know, when you want to do it on a lot of characters, yes, it's a lot of, it is a lot of questing to get through, but, you know, that's just unfortunately the nature of the beast. But I totally buy that as a good reason. And PvP I don't really talk about as much, but he did say one thing that I thought, well, that's sort of a matter of opinion rather than a straightforward fact. And it was about prestige levels, and he was talking about the idea, you know, if you see someone on like 18 prestige, you know they have played a lot of PvP. And he specifically said, you know, for mage on prestige level 18, they've done a lot of PvP on that mage. But if it was account wide, then, you know, they just ding their warrior, and the warrior's going into battlegrounds as prestige 18. It's like, well, they haven't done it on their warrior, so it would be misleading. I think that's an opinion. It's an opinion I don't agree with. They've done this with PvP. They have this argument with PvP in a way that doesn't exist with PvE. The first instance of it is the fact that, for example, me on my Paladin, because I reached a certain PvP rank in vanilla, when I was so bored one summer that I just did loads of PvP, and it basically means that I can go to the Area 52 and get the replica Marshal and Grand Marshal gear and the Horde equivalent if I was, you know, when I took my Paladin to the Horde side, and use that for transmog. But it's not account wide. I can't do it on any other character. And the argument is, well, you did it on your paladin, you didn't do it on your hunter, so why should you get it on your hunter? And it's like, well, what I did on my paladin, I easily could have done on the hunter. It didn't actually require a lot of skill. It just required a lot of time. And they have this idea in PvP, and it doesn't apply to PvE. So in PvE, for example, you know, I might say, well, I didn't get the Iron Juggernaut mount, the one that dropped off Garrosh, Heroic Garrosh, what we'd now call Mythic Garrosh, on my mage. But my mage can ride it. In fact, my hunter actually, I think, rides that one. I think that's the ground mount for my hunter at the moment. Didn't do it on my hunter. I did it on my paladin. And the same sort of thing doesn't seem to apply there. Because I'm riding that mount on my hunter. People think, oh, you know, that hunter did Heroic Garrosh. No, I didn't. So why does it matter? It's when it's entirely a cosmetic thing. The prestige thing is less cosmetic, but again, I would still argue that player knows what they're doing in battlegrounds and in arenas. Yeah, sure, they may not play a freshly dinged warrior as well as their mage, but the same equally applies in PvE. I wouldn't expect to play a freshly dinged character as well as my main in PvE. Yet when that freshly dinged character gets to level cap, I can adopt all of the account-wide PvE stuff, including mounts and titles. And transmog if it's compatible with that character as well. So, yeah, that's a really weird one, so I don't really buy that explanation at all. But that was it for PvP. That's all you're going to get out of me. With world quests, also, you're coming back to those, they did also talk about the fact with world bosses specifically, people were making the note that the original world bosses on the Broken Shore, the Broken Isle, sorry, not the Broken Shore, are going to, you know, the item level of the stuff is still like 860, and that the actual world quests around those areas is higher now. Are there any plans to raise it? And they sort of said no, it's like, because that's the content that was supposed to go alongside Emerald Nightmare. And I think, as they quite rightly said as well, you know, you've had other ones since. So the current ones you're supposed to do now each week to get your good gear is basically the Greater Invasions, as they noted there, that the gear that drops there is basically the equivalent of normal Antorus gear. I mean, we think about it at the moment as mythic Tuma Sargeras gear. So that's fair enough. I think, because, you know, otherwise you're basically giving people, you know, the Broken Isles world bosses, the Broken Shore world bosses, and the Greater Invasions. And if you just raise the item level, you'd be giving people 3 weekly world bosses that all drop really good gear, as opposed to just the one. So I think, you know, I would say that is fair enough, and that sort of makes sense. I think where people query it is just the fact that they see the world quest on the Broken Isles. I keep mixing those up. The Broken Isles getting up higher, and it's a bit like, well, these are also old content, except of course they're also current content, because the emissary cache is still a thing, and the emissary cache of course has a chance to give legendaries. So that's why we're still encouraged to do that. As well as rep, of course, to get the bags when we get our full rep, potentially for a mount that I haven't got yet. Artifact knowledge, they've sort of said they don't foresee a situation where they're going to increase the cap from 55. It's not a definite, we're not going to, of course, one of those things. I think there's a lot of issues around artifact level and knowledge that they have changed through Legion. They've modified it, they've refined it. But yeah, they say at the moment they've no plans to raise it above 55. They don't foresee that being necessary. Obviously, they'll have already thought about Antorus and how that relates to artifact knowledge. Although we are expecting an announcement of another raid, not a big raid, but a small raid, to come after Antorus. Because it wouldn't be a major one, there's no particular need, I suppose, from their point of view, to think in terms of having another phase of AP grind. Once people have got to 75 artifact level, then again there will be no massive need to it. But it was interesting, again, talking about artifact weapons. They were talking about the idea. I mean, I asked a question, it wasn't answered, that one, but someone asked one that was sort of related. It elicited a similar answer. You know, I wanted to ask the question about why is, especially at this stage, especially with so much to do on a main character and a main spec, why there are some barriers, such as people who need to maintain several artifact weapons having a tough time of it. And although we know if you split your artifact power equally, you'll not be miles behind, you will still be behind. The way Ion Hazzikostas described it is, if you keep up to date with 2 weapons, and he said you could probably spend all your artifact power on one weapon and maybe it be level 71 was the actual number he chose, or you could have 2 of them at 68, 3 behind. And he said, and 3 behind is not that much. Now, before the Netherlight Crucible, I would agreed. I would still say, well, some people might even need to maintain 3. I don't think even druids have to maintain all 4. That's not realistic. We're talking mostly pure DPS classes, like mages, rogues, so on. Probably ought to keep all 3 handy. But there's always 2 you want to be able to switch between on any tier. 1 usually lags far enough behind that you can ignore it. But you still, you know, and I suppose you could always catch up with that if in the following tier, because of artifact knowledge, if in the following tier it suddenly rose. But at least those 2. So yeah, 3 behind before the Netherlight Crucible didn't seem that much. But with the Netherlight Crucible, it's a whole extra trait on a relic. So I don't think that really is true anymore. I think it is significant. But again, my issue with it is I don't see the benefit at all. This is what I would like them to answer in these Q&As, by the way. What do they see as the benefit? It's all right saying, oh, don't worry about it because you can maintain 2 and it's not too far behind. We can argue whether we think it's too far behind or not. What I would like them to answer is, what is the benefit in having to do them separately? Why not just have artifact power basically assigned to a character, and so all your artifacts are at the same level automatically? You don't put it onto a weapon as such, you put it onto yourself and it's your power with the artifact. You do whatever you like gameplay wise, but story wise, but gameplay wise, just have it so it's all the same, They haven't answered that to my view. I could understand, like, first of all, I thought it was just a time thing. They wanted people to spend more time grinding artifact power to put on the different weapons. But we spend so much time without doing that, because I put it on one weapon. And still, I have so much to do, and I can't do as much as I would like, fitting around other things as well. So I don't think they need the extra time sink, is what I mean. But there you go. Now, Mythic Mounts, is a really quick one, is something they talked about. So, someone asked the question, why do we only get 1 mount from the end of raid Mythic bosses, where you got 2 in Myths? And what they said there, which was perfect, he said something very interesting as well, and it's going to upset some people. I might upset some people with this. So the reason was, anyone who played in MOP will instantly know what this reason was. It was basically a silly question to ask. I don't know why they answered it. It was so silly. The reason was as simple as this. In MOP, it was the last expansion when you had 10 and 25 man raiding. So take Siege of Warcraft, for example, because you definitely got a mount at the end of that one, didn't you? I can't remember if they did in Throne of Thunder. But Siege of Warcraft, you definitely did. Off Garrosh, you got the Iron Juggernaut thing. So there was 10 man raiding, so they would do that, and there was 25 man raiding. Now, if in 10 man raiding, you know, when you killed Heroic Garrosh, as it was at the time, we'd call it Mythic now, you got a mount. Well, if you only got 1 mount and 25 man as well, that's not fair, is it? Because it would take loads longer to get your roster, the mounts, as a 25 man guild than it would as a 10 man guild. That's ridiculous. So they had 2 drop. Even then, you can sort of see proportionally, it would still take you longer with a 25 man raid, but it wasn't that bad then, because you got 2 mounts at least. It wasn't too far off. It's as simple as that. It was as simple as that. Whereas now there isn't any of that difference. That it's just 20 man. But the interesting thing he said was, I don't know whether, I've not seen anyone pick up on it yet, but I straight away picked up on it. Now I was very much on, because there was this huge 10 man versus 25 man debate about which was better, which should be done, or whether they should both be run at the same time. And people to this day will still ask things like, oh, can you see a time when raiding becomes 15 man? For me, I'm just giving up the game if that happens. Because for me, it should be, a raid is epic. Dungeon is what you do with your cozy group. You know, close group of comrades. Dungeon is, raid is epic. It's like more like an army. All right. And it should feel like that. Now, I remember the days when it was 40 man, and I know for gameplay reasons, why, and for other technical reasons as well, why they moved away from 40 man. All right, even though I still liked that system. So I understand why it went from 40 to 25 man. But even going from 25 man to 20 man has made raiding feel less epic than it used to be. Absolutely made it less epic. To go any lower is just, for me, madness. But what he said was, so he didn't just say, well, that's because in MOP you had 10 man and 25 man for the same content. He said, that's because in MOP you had 10 man and 25 man, which purported to be of the same difficulty. Basically meaning that he didn't think they were equal at all. Now, I personally didn't either, because when we did the 25 man and then we did Outruns in 10 man, we found it a lot easier. But I'm not going to, kick that can of worms over. But nonetheless, the fact that he said purported, I thought was very, very telling. And it gave me a bit of confidence, at least, that they wouldn't do anything as silly as reduce the raid size, because obviously he doesn't feel that it was sensible to have the small scale one either. I mean, I still think to this day that the reason they made raids 20 man when they went to this mythic system was not because 20 man is a good number, but because they didn't want to leave it as 25 man, because then what it would be like is getting rid of 10 man. Whereas what they did was get rid of 10 and 25 man and make a new one. So I think it was just a PR thing. I think it would be better as 25 man. And I keep hoping that they will think that enough dust has settled to go and just increase the raid size again. And some people will think, oh no, it's so difficult to recruit, but even harder to recruit then. I think it's easier in some ways. The bigger raid sizes are easier to recruit for, because it means you can have all the different classes in there. At the moment, you're trying to fill your roster up with the people who have the utility that you need. Whereas, and that's what I mean about, the classes who don't bring utility on that fight sort of get frozen out because there's only like 1 or 2 spots for them. You open it up to 25 man, you create a situation where there can be 4 or 5 spots for them. So not such an issue. It would increase like the number of people that could actually raid at the level they want to raid as well. But anyway, that's that one. RNG was the big one. But I'm going to say a short amount about it because I talked about good RNG and bad RNG in a video some time ago. But again, it came up and he was talking about, an RNG is a core part of the game. And he said something quite interesting that triggered in me. Because I was talking about, because I can instantly, I think, recognise what the community would find good RNG and bad RNG. You sort of mention it and you sort of know. Like, good RNG is things like, procs or crits and stuff like that when you DPS. Yeah, you know how everyone is. They go, oh, I got rubbish procs. Usually, most of the time, when they're saying it all the time, you didn't get rubbish procs, you just didn't get good procs, is what you actually mean. But you also know, when it comes to procs and crits and stuff like that in your DPS, over the course of an evening's raiding, let's say you do progress, you do 40 pulls, something like that, then it's going to even out. You get it's this normal distribution, isn't it? You're going to get most of your stuff somewhere in the middle. You'll get a small number of very bad pulls. You'll get a small number of very good pulls. And that's how it works out. That's sort of okay. And everything, all of this RNG does follow the normal distribution. But as soon as he said something like, he said about it averaging out for the player, about something, and I forgot what it was now, that doesn't. And then it hit to me. You can actually, I think you can define it now, what is good RNG and what's bad RNG. And I think it's where the RNG is normally distributed for the player, then it's good. People are okay with it. Where it's normally distributed only globally, then it's bad. Now, I'll give you an example of this. So, the crits and the procs and stuff like that, that is normally distributed over the course of a night, certainly over the course of a full reset of raiding. So that's fine. People are okay with that. Take loot. So a raid first opens up and you first go in the first week, you do your normal heroics. And let's say the trinket you really want or the tier you really want doesn't drop that week. Well, that's sort of okay. But as long as over the first few weeks, stuff drops. Whether you get it or not is another matter. But stuff drops. Again, that's okay because it does, that loot drop-in does drop, follow that normal distribution over a reasonable amount of time. Legendaries doesn't. So go back to Legion. let's say the first 3 months of Legion. So the first 3 months of Legion, we had 2 raids come out. Now, after 2 raids being out, and you've done it on normal or heroic at least, if not completed it on mythic, then you expect that the legendary system should have averaged itself out for you. But it didn't. It did globally. Roughly not equal numbers of people would have got, it would have followed normal distribution, not only for numbers of legendaries, but which legendaries were dropping. But for the individual player, it didn't. So I think at that time, I probably had 2. But again, it was 2. One was actually quite good. Well, both of them were all right. I had one good one and one utility one. But as utility ones went, it was all right. It was all right. Some players had 2 terrible ones. Some players had 1 terrible one. Some players had 2 good ones, or maybe even several good ones. You know what I mean? So globally, it would have been normally distributed. But for the individual, it wasn't. For the individual, some people it was okay. Like mine was okay. No complaints. Not brilliant, but not bad. Some people's was great, some people's was terrible. But looking at the individual doesn't look at it in terms of global terms. They don't think to themselves, oh, well, it's all right, I haven't got good legendaries, but some people have, so it's fine, isn't it? No, they don't think like that. They think, I ain't got good legendaries. And I think that's when it causes bad RNG. And the same applies to the Netherlight Crucible. Globally speaking, roughly even numbers of people would have got the good traits, roughly even number of people got the BIS traits for them and so on, and some got the terrible traits. But for the individual player, you either got good ones or bad ones or mediocre ones like me. If you've got bad ones, that's, it's not going to average out over a reasonable amount of time. It could take months before it averages out. Unless you're a player that doesn't do a high level of content. Like, let's say the content you're doing is like normal to Sargeras. Well, most of your rates are probably going to come from the Veiled Argonite turn-ins for the vendor. In which case, yeah, you get a bad one day, do it the next day, do your content the next day, get another one. You've got a reasonable chance there. But for players who are doing serious, like raiding and dungeons, and let's face it, those are the players who are going to most be hurt by bad traits and most benefit from good ones, the one where it most matters, they're not going to get that normal distribution over a reasonable amount of time for them. It's just a global normal distribution. So I think that's what I would define as good and bad RNG now. I said I was going to be quick with that. I don't think it was that quick at all. The flying on Argus, I'd already talked about this before. This is really a quick one. And it basically just confirmed what I had suspected anyway. I say suspected, pretty much knew. They were asked the question, will Argus ever have flying? They said no. And they did actually say it's just not possible. The way it was designed, he said you had a choice with the design of Argus things. You could either have flying on it or you could have these spectacular backdrops like we have now. Because it is true, he said it himself, you've got 3 completely disconnected zones of a shattered world, and you've got all those backdrops which are basically illusions. And that's the problem. People just think, well, can't you just turn flying on? You can't, because it's all smoke and mirrors, the Argus zones. Really is. It gives the impression of, and you sort of know it's not true anyway, can't you? You can see it. It gives the impression of being on a world when you're not. You're in a little box. It's like virtual reality within the game. So you can't actually fly. They could never make it possible to fly on those zones. That's all there is to it. It's not possible. So it will never be coming. And it's not because they don't want flying on it, although I strongly suspect they don't. It wouldn't surprise me if they deliberately designed the zones in the way they do, such that no matter how much fuss people kicked up, it's like, it's not even technically possible. So, but it isn't. It isn't technically possible. That's all there is to it. Tanking. There's an interesting one, tanking. Which brought me to mind in terms of how tanking has changed. So what they talked about, the issue was, I think, about the fact that some tanks, their active mitigation is much simpler than others. And he was saying he thinks that the real skill with tanking is not so much the keeping up the active mitigation. It's the other skills, which I would sort of agree with. I mean, tanking when it started off in the game, there were still good and bad tanks, by the way, don't get me wrong. But it was so simple. I'll tell you how simple it was. I could tank every now and then when I was required to tank, I could tank. And it was simple. Because all you had to do was stand in the right spot, face whatever you were tanking the right way, and keep aggro on it. Actually, that was more difficult as a paladin. But, you know, the rest of it was fairly straightforward. And when I was doing it as a like, for example, when we did Sunwell Plateau and TBC, when you had proper tanking spec for a paladin, I used to have to switch between Ret and Prot at a time when you couldn't just switch between them, when dual spec wasn't a thing. So I had to keep popping off to Stormwind to respec. Guild funded it, don't worry. But I did the first 2 bosses as Ret. Then I would do Felmist as Prot. Then I'd go back and I'd do Eridar Twins as Ret. Then Murrow as Prot. And then Kil'jaeden as Ret. And so I hardly ever saw any trash because I was busy respecking. But the fact is that, you know, as a Ret specialist, I could tank. I could just go and tank like that without really practicing. Now, I do a pretty bad job of tanking if I suddenly have to tank. Because I don't really practice it, I don't really like it. It's more skillful now than it used to be. That's definitely true. But I think still there is an issue that tanks do have to focus on the survival aspects of their abilities, not just the positioning, which is more tricky now. You're not just standing in one spot, for example. You need to be able to move the boss. Sometimes you need to be able to move the boss incrementally, really slowly, and that's sometimes awkward depending on the hitbox. Sometimes you have to just move it in the right place. Sometimes you have to be very aware of what's going on. There's an awful lot of things there, which is certainly true, which didn't used to exist. But I still do think, you know, it is easier to do that along with maintaining your defensiveness with some tanks than it is with others. Which I'm not sure he really sort of tackled there. But those are the sort of main topics I want to talk about in this one. There were a couple of others I want to do in separate vlogs as well, which includes, if you were interested in what I'm thinking about, what they said about tier set bonuses, I definitely want to talk about that, but in a separate video. Also what they said about class tuning data, that's going to be in a separate video as well. But in terms of the general things we'll talk about in the Q&A, those are the things they said. That is what my commentary on it is. If you've got ideas of your own, put them in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.